Welcome back to Nightfall History. Tonight we are going somewhere that most history books either skip entirely or reduce to a single scandalous footnote into the inner chambers of the ancient world's most powerful courts, where some of the most intelligent, educated, politically influential, and frankly, remarkable women in history lived out their lives in a system that was simultaneously luxurious and deeply constraining. We are talking about concubines, not the myth of them, the reality. And the reality, it turns out, is far more interesting than the myth. The word concubine tends to conjure a fairly specific image in the modern imagination, something decorative, passive, defined entirely by proximity to a powerful man. That image is wrong in almost every particular. The women who held this position in the great courts of the ancient world were in many cases extraordinarily skilled, politically savvy, culturally educated, and in some instances more powerful than most of the men who technically outranked them. They navigated systems of hierarchy and court politics that would have broken most people using intelligence, charm, cultural mastery, and occasionally a well-timed alliance to survive and sometimes to thrive. We are going to look at three of history's most fascinating examples: the imperial concubines of ancient China, the women of the Egyptian royal household, and the extraordinary institution of the Ottoman harem at its height. Three civilizations, three continents, three completely different systems, and a set of surprisingly consistent truths about what it actually meant to be one of these women. Let us start in China, because China's system was among the most elaborate, most formally structured, and most thoroughly documented in human history. If you wanted to design a bureaucracy around something, ancient China was absolutely the civilization for the job, and they brought that same organizational enthusiasm to the imperial court in all its aspects. The Chinese imperial system of concubinage had roots going back thousands of years, but it reached its most formalized expression during the Han Dynasty and the dynasties that followed it. By the time the system was fully developed, the imperial court maintained a hierarchy of women so precisely organized that it had ranks, titles, salaries, and formal protocols for everything from how a woman should walk through a corridor to the exact number of attendants she was entitled to based on her status. The Chinese imperial bureaucracy did not do things by halves. At the top of the pyramid sat the empress, the official wife, the mother of the legitimate heir, the woman whose position was theoretically unassailable. Below her were the imperial consorts, ranked in descending order with titles that varied by dynasty, but which typically numbered somewhere between 9 and dozens of official categories. Below the consorts were the concubines proper, and below them were the palace ladies, and below them were the palace servants, many of whom might theoretically be elevated at any time if they caught the emperor's eye. It was essentially a career ladder, a very particular kind of career ladder. The process by which a woman entered this system was itself highly regulated. Periodically, and particularly at the beginning of a new emperor's reign, officials would travel to the provinces to identify suitable candidates. The criteria were detailed and exacting. Physical health was assessed. Family background was investigated. And then came the education, which is where things get genuinely impressive. A woman selected for the imperial court was not simply placed in a building and left to her own devices. She was trained comprehensively. The curriculum included classical literature and poetry, not as light entertainment, but as a serious intellectual discipline, because a woman who could compose elegant verse on short notice was worth considerably more at court than one who could not. She studied music, typically the guqin, the ancient 7-string instrument, whose mastery required years of dedicated practice and which was associated in Chinese cultural thought with moral cultivation and refined sensibility. She studied calligraphy, which in Chinese culture was not merely handwriting, but an art form with deep philosophical dimensions, a practice through which one's character and inner cultivation were said to be visible to the trained eye. She studied history and the classical texts, the Confucian canon, the great historical chronicles, the philosophical works that formed the intellectual backbone of Chinese civilization. She learned court etiquette in precise detail, how to bow, how to address superiors and inferiors, how to move, how to speak, how to compose one's expression in various social contexts. She learned to manage a household of considerable complexity. because the internal administration of the women's quarters was itself a small bureaucracy requiring organizational skill and political intelligence. There was also the art of conversation, which sounds trivial until you consider who she might be conversing with. An emperor in China was not merely a head of state. He was in the Confucian worldview the son of heaven, the mediating link between the divine order and the human world, a figure of cosmic significance surrounded at all times by officials and ceremonial protocol that made genuine, spontaneous human interaction essentially impossible in most contexts. The inner court was one of the very few spaces where something closer to real conversation could happen. A woman who could be genuinely interesting to talk to, who knew the classical texts well enough to engage with them, who could respond to a piece of poetry with a poem of her own, who had something worth saying about history and philosophy expressed with appropriate tact, was in this environment valuable in ways that went beyond the obvious. Medicine and health management were other areas in which senior women of the inner court often developed real expertise. Overseeing a community of hundreds of women meant dealing with illness, childbirth, dietary needs, and the health challenges that came with a large population living in relatively confined circumstances. Some senior palace women became genuine practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine, knowledgeable in herbal remedies, dietary therapy, and the principles of Chinese medical theory, which gave them a further kind of authority and usefulness within the community. The political education, however, was perhaps the most important of all, and it was never formal. Nobody sat a junior concubine down and taught her how court politics worked. She learned by watching, by listening, by making careful note of who spoke to whom, who was elevated, and who was sidelined, which alliances held and which crumbled. She learned which senior women it was wise to cultivate and which to avoid. She learned how information moved through the inner court and how to position herself as someone whom others would want to inform. The inner court was in this sense a school that never announced itself as one, and the women who learned its lessons fastest were the ones most likely to survive and advance. What the training was producing, in other words, was not a decorative object, but a complete court woman, educated, culturally sophisticated, socially skilled, and equipped to navigate one of the most complex political environments on earth. Because that is what the inner court of a Chinese dynasty was, a political environment. Every interaction was freighted with meaning. Every alliance mattered. Every rivalry was managed with extreme care, because the consequences of a misstep could be severe. The goal of every concubine, stated plainly, was to produce a son. Not just any son, the son who would become heir. This was the lever that could change everything. A concubine who gave birth to the boy who eventually became emperor went from being a relatively junior member of the court hierarchy to being effectively the most powerful woman in the empire. She became the Empress Dowager, the emperor's mother, and in Chinese political culture, the Empress Dowager's authority could be extraordinary. Several of China's most powerful de facto rulers were women who had entered the court as concubines and whose sons had become emperors. The most famous example is Wu Zetian, who entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a low-ranking concubine in her early teens, survived his death, which usually meant being sent to a Buddhist convent for the rest of one's life, which was not a great outcome, by being noticed by the next emperor. Gaozong rose through influence and political maneuvering to become his empress, effectively ruled alongside him as he grew ill, and after his death became the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. She was brilliant, ruthless, a capable administrator, a patron of Buddhism, and a woman who had navigated the most dangerous political environment imaginable, from the very bottom to the very top. She started as a junior palace girl. She ended up ruling China. Most concubine stories were less dramatic, though not necessarily less interesting. The day-to-day life inside the women's quarters, the inner court, known in Chinese as the Neiting, was structured, hierarchical, and governed by an elaborate system of protocols. Women were organized into their own ranked communities, with senior concubines holding authority over junior ones. There were officials whose entire job was to manage the administrative needs of the inner court. There were physicians. There were teachers. There were eunuch servants who could move between the inner court and the outer court, the world of male officials, and who therefore became inevitably crucial conduits of information and influence. The eunuchs of the Chinese imperial court are themselves a fascinating and complicated historical subject. As the only men permitted in the inner court, they occupied a unique position, trusted necessary, possessing information that nobody else had, and therefore potentially extremely powerful. Some of the most influential figures in Chinese imperial history were eunuchs who had cultivated relationships with concubines and empresses, and used those relationships to shape the political decisions of emperors who trusted their household staff more than their ministers. The inner and outer courts were officially separated. In practice, information flowed between them constantly, and the women of the inner court were never as politically isolated as the system's designers intended. Life in the inner court was comfortable in material terms and could be genuinely intellectually rich. The best educated women in China were often those at court with access to libraries, teachers, and cultural events that most people could only dream of. But it was also a life of profound restriction. Movement was controlled. Contact with the outside world was limited. A concubine who fell from favor might spend decades in the inner court without ever seeing the emperor again, aging and gilded. Irrelevance. The system gave, and it took often at the same time. Egypt's approach to the royal household was, like most things Egyptian, simultaneously ancient, elaborate, and somewhat mysterious, because the Egyptians left extensive records of their official history and their religious practices, but were considerably more reticent about the intimate details of palace life. What we know comes from administrative records, artistic representations, occasional correspondence, and the patient work of archaeologists who have spent generations trying to reconstruct a world from fragments. The Egyptian pharaoh maintained principal wife, the great royal wife, whose status was sacred and whose children held the primary claim to the throne. But alongside her, pharaohs typically maintained households of secondary wives and royal women whose status was real, but whose position in the hierarchy was precisely defined. These women were not mere ornaments. They were part of a complex system of diplomacy, alliance, and political management that ran through the royal court like a second skeleton. Foreign princesses were a particularly important category. When the great powers of the ancient Near East, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylon, Mitanni, made peace with each other, they typically sealed the agreement with a marriage. The Hittite king would send a daughter to the Egyptian pharaoh's court. The Babylonian king would send a princess. Various Syrian and Canaanite rulers would contribute daughters as well. These women arrived in Egypt with their own retinues, their own customs, their own languages, and their own expectations, and they were incorporated into the royal household where they lived, were treated with the respect due their birth, and served as living proof of the alliance between their father's kingdom and the Egyptian crown. The correspondence that survives from the Bronze Age diplomatic world, a remarkable collection of clay tablets known as the Amarna letters, gives us occasional glimpses of how this system worked from the perspective of the women's families. Egyptian kings were expected to send gifts to their foreign allies, and one of the recurring themes in this correspondence is foreign rulers asking, sometimes demanding, that Egypt send women in return. The Egyptian pharaoh was notably reluctant to send Egyptian royal women to foreign courts. The formula that appears repeatedly in the records is something to the effect of, since ancient times, no Egyptian princess has been given to a foreign king. Egypt was happy to receive foreign women. It was considerably less enthusiastic about sending its own. This asymmetry tells you something about the relative power Egypt felt it held in these negotiations. Within the Egyptian palace, the women of the royal household lived in a dedicated section called the Ipninst, roughly the king's dwelling or apartments, which was a world unto itself. It had its own administration, its own economic activities, its own hierarchy. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ghurab, a town in the Fayum region that served as a royal residence and probably housed women of the royal court, suggests that these communities were not simply passive enclosures. They produced textiles. Egypt's royal workshops were famous for the quality of their linen and managed significant economic resources. The education and accomplishments expected of women in the Egyptian royal household reflected Egyptian cultural values in ways that are distinctly different from the Chinese model. Music was central. Harps, lutes, sistrums, a characteristic Egyptian rattle, used in religious contexts, were instruments associated with beauty, divinity, and the favor of the goddess Hathor. Women of the royal court were often depicted in tomb paintings and temple reliefs, playing music and participating in religious ceremonies in ways that gave them a genuine sacred role, rather than merely a decorative one. Dance was another significant skill, and not in the casual sense we might assume. Egyptian ritual dance was a sophisticated practice with religious dimensions. Certain dances were performed specifically to honor the gods, to mark religious festivals, to accompany funerary rites. Women trained in these forms were not entertainers. In the modern sense, they were participants in sacred performances that had cosmological significance. The line between art and religion in ancient Egypt was never very clear, and women of the royal court could occupy a space where those two things merged. Literacy in ancient Egypt was not as widespread as in some later civilizations, but there is evidence that women in elite contexts could read and write hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphs used for everyday administrative purposes. The management of a large royal household required record-keeping, correspondence, and administrative competence. A senior woman overseeing hundreds of other women servants and resources needed practical organizational skills as much as artistic ones. One of the most striking aspects of the Egyptian royal women's world is how visible they were in the official record compared to what we might expect. Great royal wives appear prominently in temple reliefs and royal inscriptions and statuary. Nefertiti, the wife of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, is depicted in her famous painted limestone bust as a figure of extraordinary elegance and power. And in the actual political and religious revolution that Akhenaten attempted, she seems to have been not merely a companion, but a genuine participant. Some scholars have argued, based on certain inscriptional evidence, that Nefertiti may have ruled as pharaoh herself for a brief period after Akhenaten's death under the name Nefermeten. The evidence is debated, as it often is with ancient history, but the mere fact that the debate is possible tells you something about the space these women occupied. Hatshepsut is the clearest example of the Egyptian royal woman's potential trajectory. She began as the daughter of a pharaoh, became the wife of a pharaoh, served as regent for her stepson, and then, in one of ancient history's most extraordinary power moves, declared herself pharaoh, had herself depicted in male regalia, including the ceremonial beard, and ruled Egypt for roughly 20 years as one of its most successful and prosperous monarchs. She built the magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari. She organized a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt. She constructed obelisks at Karnak that still stand. Her story is not quite the story of a concubine, but it illustrates something fundamental about the Egyptian royal women's world. The system contained more possibilities than the systems official rules suggested. And then there is the Ottoman harem, which is probably the most mythologized, most misunderstood, and in some ways the most genuinely extraordinary of all the institutions we are discussing tonight. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred, and referred originally to the private restricted quarters of a Muslim household, the space reserved for family and not accessible to outsiders. In the context of the Ottoman imperial court, the harem was specifically the harem-i Humayun, the imperial harem, which occupied a large section of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and which, at the height of the Ottoman Empire, housed hundreds of women, thousands of people, if you count the entire staff, and constituted one of the most complex and politically significant institutions in the empire. The Western image of the Ottoman harem derived largely from Orientalist paintings of the 18th and 19th centuries, many of which were painted by European men who had never been within 100 miles of one, is almost entirely fictional. These paintings depicted passive, languid women lounging decoratively in various states of undress, which tells you considerably more about the fantasies of European male painters than about the actual lived experience of women in the Ottoman imperial household. The reality was again an institution of enormous complexity, internal politics, and for the women who successfully navigated genuine power, the women who entered the imperial harem did so primarily as slaves, a fact that is essential to understanding the system without sanitizing it. Most came from the Caucasus region's Circassian women, were particularly prized and were often brought to Istanbul specifically for this purpose. Some came from elsewhere in the empire or beyond it. They entered the harem at young ages, often in their early to mid-teens, and began a period of education and training that was, by the standards of the time, exceptional. The training of a new harem girl was comprehensive and lasted years. She learned Ottoman Turkish, the literary language of the court, which was heavily influenced by Arabic and Persian, and was quite different from the vernacular, Turkish spoken in the streets. She learned to read and write in this language, which gave her access to a rich literary and intellectual culture. She studied the Quran and Islamic theology and practice. She learned music, the oud, the kanan, the ney instruments, with deep roots in the classical Ottoman musical tradition, which was itself one of the great musical cultures of the medieval and early modern world. She learned to sew and embroider. With a skill that amounted to high art, Ottoman embroidery was extraordinarily sophisticated, and the production of fine textiles was a significant cultural and economic activity within the harem. She learned to dance, to sing, to compose poetry in the courtly tradition. She learned the elaborate protocols of court etiquette, how to address the sultan, how to address senior women, how to conduct herself in every imaginable social situation. And she learned the political landscape of the institution she now inhabited, because understanding who had power, who was rising, who was falling, and how to navigate among them was not optional. It was survival. At the top of the harem's internal hierarchy sat the valid sultan, the sultan's mother. Her authority within the harem was absolute, and her political influence could extend far beyond it. During a period that historians call the Sultanate of Women, roughly the late 16th through the mid-17th century, several valid sultans and powerful hasekis, or sultan's favorites, exercised extraordinary influence over Ottoman imperial policy. They conducted diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers. They issued orders to governors. They managed the enormous financial resources under their control. They built mosques and charitable foundations that still stand in Istanbul today. The most extraordinary figure of this period was Hürrem Sultan, known to Europeans as Roxolana, who had entered the harem as a slave from somewhere in what is now Ukraine or Poland, and who rose to become the wife, the official legally recognized wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, which was unprecedented in Ottoman history. Sultans did not marry their concubines. It was not done. And then Hürrem happened, and suddenly it was done. She was, by all surviving accounts, a woman of exceptional intelligence, political acuity, and personal force. She corresponded with the Polish king. She influenced Suleiman's political decisions. She was involved to a degree that historians still debate in the succession struggles that would determine which of Suleiman's sons followed him on the throne. She was also apparently genuinely funny. Historical sources mention her with her humor. Her ability to make Suleiman laugh, which in a court as formal and protocol-bound as the Ottoman one was itself a kind of political power. Hürrem also commissioned architecture on a considerable scale: mosque schools, a bathhouse in Istanbul that still stands, charitable foundations in Jerusalem and Mecca. This was not simply generosity. In the Ottoman world, building mosques and charitable institutions was a primary mechanism through which powerful individuals expressed their status, earned religious merit, and embedded themselves permanently in the landscape of the city. Hürrem's buildings were a statement written in stone about who she was and what she had become. They outlasted the empire that produced them. The daily texture of life in the imperial harem was shaped by strict routine. Mornings began with prayer, 5 times daily as Islamic practice required, and the rhythm of the day was organized around these fixed points. Meals were served at designated times from the imperial kitchens, which were a substantial operation in themselves, producing food for the hundreds of people in the palace complex. Afternoons might involve lessons, practice of musical instruments, embroidery work, or reading. Evenings could include organized entertainment, music performances, storytelling, poetry readings, or simply the quieter social life of a large community of women who had, in many cases, lived together for years and formed genuine bonds of friendship, rivalry, mentorship, and something that probably looked a great deal like family. The relationship between senior and junior women in the harem was one of the institutions. more complicated social dynamics. A senior woman, a hasiki, a valid sultan, or simply an older concubine who had been in the palace for decades, could be a mentor, a protector, a patron, or a political obstacle, depending on the circumstances. Junior women cultivated these relationships carefully. A well-placed alliance with a senior figure could mean better apartments, better assignments, more access to resources and information. A poorly managed relationship could mean years of marginalization. The social intelligence required to navigate all of this was considerable, and it was developed in most cases by women who had entered the harem as teenagers with no previous experience of anything remotely resembling it. A concubine who was noticed by the sultan and bore him a son became a hasiki, a favored concubine with formal recognition and significant privileges. She had her own apartments, her own staff, her own income. She was no longer navigating the hierarchy as a relatively junior figure, but operating from a position of considerable security. If her son survived, and in the brutal Ottoman succession system survival was not guaranteed as princes who lost, succession struggles tended to die and became sultan. She became valid sultan and effectively the most powerful woman in the empire. The internal politics of the harem were complex precisely because the stakes were so high. Every concubine who bore a son had an interest in seeing that son succeed, which meant she had an interest in the failure of every other son, and therefore in the failure of every other concubine who might produce a rival. These rivalries were real, occasionally vicious, and occasionally fatal. The harem was not a peaceful place, despite the image of tranquil luxury that popular imagination has imposed on it. It was an arena, and the women within it understood that what is striking when you look at these women clearly is how much of their power derived from things that had nothing to do with physical proximity to the sultan. The valid sultan's power came from institutional position, from the networks she had built over decades, from the financial resources she controlled, from the loyalty of the harem staff, and the eunuchs who managed it. The Hazik's power came from her son, from her relationship with the sultan, from her political alliances. The junior concubine's survival came from her cultural skills, her intelligence, her ability to read the social environment and position herself advantageously within it. It was not freedom. It was never freedom. These women did not choose the system they inhabited, and it is important not to romanticize institutions that began in many cases with enslavement. But within the constraints, they did not choose. Many of these women exercised remarkable agency, demonstrated extraordinary abilities, and left marks on history that are only now being fully recognized and studied. What does it all mean taken together? What do we make of these three systems: the Chinese inner court, the Egyptian royal household, the Ottoman imperial harem, when we step back and look at them as a whole? First thing that strikes you, if you are paying attention, is how consistently wrong the popular image is. In almost every culture that has inherited stories about these institutions through Orientalist painting, through Victorian novels, who Hollywood films, the women are passive. They wait. They are decorative, transient, interchangeable. The actual historical record tells almost exactly the opposite story. These women were active. They formed alliances. They accumulated knowledge. They built networks. They pursued long-term strategies. They occasionally brought down rivals and occasionally shaped the policies of empires. The gap between the myth and the reality is not a small one. It is a chasm. The second striking thing is how much these institutions invested in the women they contained. The training a woman received upon entering the Chinese inner court, the Ottoman imperial harem, or the Egyptian royal household represented a significant resource commitment on the part of the institution. Languages, music, literature, etiquette, administration. These things took time to teach and required qualified teachers to teach them. The investment made sense, of course, from the institution's perspective. A well-educated, culturally sophisticated woman was more valuable to the court than an uneducated one in multiple ways. But the result, unintentionally, was that these institutions produced some of the most intellectually accomplished women of their respective eras. The third thing, and perhaps the most important, is the question of agency. How much did these women choose? The honest answer is not the entry point. Most of them did not choose to be where they were. Foreign princesses sent to seal diplomatic alliances did not draft the treaties. Slaves brought to Istanbul or selected by provincial officials in China had no say in the matter. This is a real and significant fact about these institutions, and it should not be glossed over. The system was built on power differentials that were real and often brutal. But agency is not a learned thing, and the historical record is full of women who, within constraints they did not choose, exercised remarkable choices. They chose which alliances to form and which to avoid. They chose how to deploy their cultural skills and when. They chose, sometimes at considerable risk, to advocate for their children, for their positions, for policies they believed in. The valid sultan who conducted diplomatic correspondence with foreign heads of state was making choices. Wu Zetian, navigating her way from junior palace girl to emperor of China, was making choices at every step. Hürrem Sultan, engineering a marriage that had no precedent in Ottoman history, was making choices. Not free choices. No choice made within a system of constraint is entirely free, but choices nonetheless, and consequential ones. A few things stand out. First, all three systems required of their women a level of education and cultural sophistication. That was, by the standards of their respective times and places, exceptional. The average woman in ancient China could not read classical texts or play the duqin. The average woman in ancient Egypt was not trained in sacred dance and ritual music. The average woman in the Ottoman world did not speak multiple languages or compose poetry in the courtly tradition. The women of these courts were paradoxically among the best educated and most culturally accomplished women of their eras, precisely because the systems they inhabited demanded it. Second, the boundary between concubine and political actor was far more permeable than the official structure suggested. In all three civilizations, women who were formally positioned as members of a ruler's household managed to exercise political influence, sometimes enormous political influence, through the relationships, information, and resources they controlled. The inner court was never as separate from the outer court. The private was never as separate from the political as the men who designed these systems intended. Third, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable observation, the power these women could accumulate was real, but it was always contingent. It depended on the sultan remaining interested, on the son surviving, on the emperor maintaining his favor, on alliances holding. It was power without institutional foundation of its own power that had to be continuously renewed and defended through relationships that could change without warning. The women who thrived in these environments were those who understood this instability and planned accordingly, building networks, cultivating loyalties, managing resources, and positioning themselves so that their influence survived the inevitable fluctuations of court favor. The lives of these women resist easy summary because they resist easy categorization. They were not simply victims, though the systems they inhabited were often unjust. They were not simply powerful, though many of them wielded genuine power. They were human beings of considerable intelligence and ability who operated within constraints they did not choose, and who, in case after documented case, managed to do extraordinary things within those constraints. There is another layer worth naming, which is how these women are remembered, or rather how they have mostly been forgotten. The official records of Chinese dynasties, Egyptian pharaohs, and Ottoman sultans were written by men about men for the purpose of documenting the public political history that men were considered to own. The inner court, the women's quarters, the harem, these spaces were treated as private, domestic, and therefore historically unimportant. The women who inhabited them were recorded only when they intruded visibly onto the official stage, when a valid sultan issued an order that ended up in the administrative archive, when a Hatshepsut claimed the throne, when a Hürrem Sultan's name appeared in diplomatic correspondence. The daily texture of their lives, the conversations and rivalries and friendships and intellectual lives they led, most of this is simply gone. What remains are fragments, a poem attributed to a palace, woman, a tombstone inscription, a painting in a tomb, an administrative record listing names and salaries, a diplomatic letter that survived when the palace that housed it did not. Archaeologists excavating sites associated with royal women's quarters occasionally find objects that give texture to these lives. Cosmetic containers, musical instruments, objects of personal devotion evidence of weaving and textile production. Each fragment is a small window. The room behind it is vast and mostly dark. History has a habit of forgetting them, partly because they operated in spaces the historical record was not designed to capture, and partly because the people writing history were for most of history men who were not inside those spaces and did not fully understand what happened there. The recovery of these women's histories, painstaking, partial, still ongoing, is one of the genuinely exciting frontiers of historical research. Every year, scholars find new evidence, reinterpret old evidence, and push our understanding a little further into the rooms that history left dark. Tonight, we've only opened the door. Behind it are thousands of individual stories, women whose names we know, and women whose names are lost, women who changed the course of dynasties, and women who lived quietly and left no trace that has survived. All of them were real. All of them deserve to be remembered as the complex, capable, particular human beings they were, rather than the simplified images that the centuries have layered over them. There is one more thing worth saying before we close. Something that cuts across all three civilizations and speaks to something universal about the human experience of power. In each of these systems, the women who were most successful were not necessarily the most beautiful, the most obedient, or even the most strategically ruthless. They were almost without exception the most adaptable, the ones who could read a changing situation quickly, the ones who understood that the court they inhabited today was not necessarily the court they would inhabit tomorrow, and who had built the skills, relationships, and resources to survive the transition. Empresses died, sultans changed their favorites, dynasties collapsed and reformed. Through all of it, the women who endured were those who had never put all their weight on a single point of support. That is, when you think about it, not a bad lesson for anyone navigating any complicated human institution. The ancient courts of China, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire were extreme environments, and the stakes involved survival itself, in many cases, were far higher than most of us will face. But the fundamental human skills they demanded: adaptability, social intelligence, the ability to build genuine relationships in environments where everything is also political, the patience to play a long game without losing sight of the immediate move. These are not skills that belong to the past. They are as relevant now as they were 2,000 years ago, which may be part of why these women's stories, when we actually tell them, honestly feel so unexpectedly alive. That is enough history for one night. Sleep well and let the past settle. Around you, all its complexity, all its humanity, all its extraordinary stubborn refusal to be as simple as we sometimes wish it were. We'll see you next time on Nightfall History.